The dog heard it first. Maura Callahan was at the kitchen sink when Biscuit lifted his gray muzzle from the floor and looked toward the door with the particular stillness that was not a warning and not a greeting, but something between the two, the kind of attention that said something is out there, and I don't yet know what it is. She dried her hands on the dish towel without hurrying. She had lived alone on this property for 4 years, and she had learned that hurrying toward the unknown was a habit that belonged to people who still had something left to lose quickly. It was late October, and the Wyoming evening was coming in hard off the Absaroka foothills, that flat, pale dark that arrives before the stars, when the sky is the color of a bruise that doesn't know it's healing yet. She could hear the wind moving through the tall grass past the fence line, and the cattle were quiet in the lower pasture, which told her the visitor had come in from the road and not across the land. She stood at the door for a moment with her hand on the latch. Then she opened it. The man on her porch was leaning against the post like he was trying not to fall down. He was younger than she'd expected. She hadn't known she was expecting anything. Somewhere in his late 30s, dark-haired and trail-dirty, with a canvas pack slung off one shoulder and the other arm pressed against his side in the way that meant he was protecting something beneath the jacket. His boots were good boots, worn hard. His eyes, when they found hers, were the eyes of someone who had run out of the kind of pride that stops people from knocking on strangers' doors. "I'm sorry," he said. "I saw the light." Maura looked past him to the road. No truck, no horse, no other shape in the darkening air. "You walk from the highway?" "From the turnoff," he said. "About 6 miles back, I think." She looked at his arm. "You think you can make it inside, or would you rather sit down first?" He almost smiled. Inside would be better. She stepped back and let him in, and Biscuit got up and sniffed his hand with no aggression, which Maura had long ago decided was the most honest character reference available to her. "Before you find out what that man carried in with him, the thing that would change everything on this land before the sun came up, I want to take a moment to ask where you're tuning in from tonight. Whether you're in a farmhouse kitchen in Montana, a back porch in Queensland, a living room in Scotland, or halfway through the dishes in South Africa, drop your location in the comments below. It matters to me to know who's keeping me company out here. I write these stories for you." His name was Daniel Voss. He told her this while she was filling the kettle, not because she'd asked, but because men who needed help tended to give their name before anything else, as though it was the first thing they could offer that cost them nothing. She put the kettle on and turned to look at him properly. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his jacket half off, and she could see the bandaging now, strips of cloth wrapped around his left forearm, dark at the center. "Not fresh. Not well done. That needs to be redone," she said. "I know. I'll do it after the tea." He didn't argue, which told her the pain had moved past the stage where arguing felt worth it. She'd been a ranch medic volunteer through most of her 40s, before the ranch had stopped being something she and Walt ran together and started being something she ran alone. She still kept a full kit under the bathroom sink. Her hands remembered what to do with it, even when the rest of her was thinking about something else. And right now the rest of her was thinking about who this man was and what had happened to him and why it had happened 6 miles from her gate. She set the tea in front of him and sat down across the table. "All right," she said. "Tell me." He looked at the mug for a moment. Then he told her. He was a livestock auditor, had been for 11 years, working mostly for banks and insurance firms who needed eyes on collateral herds before they approved a loan or paid a claim. He'd been contracted 3 weeks ago by a lender in Cody to assess the herd inventory on the Prentiss operation, a cattle concern spread across about 18,000 acres in the valley east of her. She knew the name. Everyone in a 40-mile radius knew the Prentiss name. Harlan Prentiss had been buying land in this county for a decade, and the polite word for how he did business was aggressive. Daniel had found a discrepancy, not a small one. The loan application listed 4,200 head. His count, done twice over 4 days, came to 2,800. 1,400 phantom cattle. Paper animals on a balance sheet, collateral that didn't exist, backing a loan application worth $3.5 million. He'd filed his preliminary report with the lender on a Tuesday. By Thursday evening, 2 men he didn't recognize had followed him out of the motel parking lot in Cody and persuaded him, using the kind of persuasion that left marks, to reconsider his figures. He'd left his truck parked behind a gas station in Meeteetse before dawn on Friday, walked into the hills, and had been moving mostly at night since. Maura listened to all of this without interrupting. She had a habit of stillness when she was thinking that some people mistook for indifference and others mistook for calm. It was neither. It was the same attention she gave to weather, the kind that was trying to tell her something she needed to hear correctly. "How long ago did they put their hands on you?" she said. 3 nights. "And the report? Is it filed or just drafted?" He looked at her steadily. "It's filed. They can't unfile it. But they can discredit me if I disappear or if my figures get challenged without my presence." She nodded slowly. "And your phone?" He pulled it from his pocket and set it on the table. The screen was cracked and dark, dead since yesterday morning. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. "You understand," she said, "that if what you're telling me is accurate, and if Harlan Prentiss has any idea where you are, this property is not safe tonight." "Yes," he said. "And you came here anyway." "I saw the light," he said again. It wasn't an excuse. It was the whole truth of the situation. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up and the first hard gust came off the mountain and rattled the kitchen window in its frame. She thought about the 4 years she'd managed this land alone, the way she'd gotten good at deciding who was telling her the truth and who was performing it. She thought about Walt, who had trusted the wrong man once in a business arrangement and never quite recovered his footing, who had said to her in the last year of his life that he wished he'd been less polite to dishonest people. She thought about the fact that Biscuit was currently lying against Daniel Voss's left boot as though he'd known the man for years. "All right," she said, and stood up. "Let me get the kit." She cleaned and redressed the wound at the kitchen table, her movements efficient and quiet while he kept his jaw set in the way of someone who had decided not to make a sound about pain. There were 2 lacerations, not deep, but poorly cared for, and bruising along the ulna that she suspected was a hairline fracture, but couldn't confirm without an X-ray. She splinted it with materials from the kit and a wooden spoon she'd never particularly liked, and he made one small involuntary sound when she set the wrap. "Sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. "You're the first person who's done anything that actually helped in 3 days." She didn't respond to that. She tied off the bandage and sat back. "I have a satellite phone," she said. "It's charged. In the morning, you can use it to call whoever you need to call." "Why not tonight?" "Because tonight I need to think," she said. "And because whoever you call, if Prentiss has reach into local communications, I'd rather they have fewer hours to react before daylight." He studied her for a moment. "You've dealt with him before." It wasn't a question. She folded the used gauze into the waste cloth and said, "He made an offer on this land 2 years ago. I declined. He made it again 6 months after that, and I declined again. The 3rd time, he sent someone to make the offer in person." She paused. "That person left the property with a different understanding of my position." He was quiet for a second. "Then, what kind of ranch is this?" "Cattle. Smaller than it was." She looked at the window. Walt's spread was bigger. "This is what I kept." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't push. She recognized something in his face, not pity, which she wouldn't have tolerated, but the careful respect of someone who understood that certain ground you don't cross without being invited. "The spare room is through there," she said, standing. "The bathroom is on the right. There's no lock on the front door, but there's a bar, and I'll put it down tonight." He stood carefully, favoring the arm. "Mrs. Callahan." "Maura," she said. "Maura." He stopped. Whatever he'd been about to say seemed to cost him more than he had available. He said instead, simply, "Thank you." She turned off the kitchen light. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Get some sleep. We've got a complicated morning ahead." She did not sleep. She sat in the dark of the living room in Walt's chair, the one she never sat in during the day, only at night when she needed to think in the particular way that chair allowed, and she worked through what she knew. She knew Daniel Voss's forearm. She'd looked at it for 20 minutes, and the injuries were what he'd said they were. She knew his eyes, the way they'd met hers without flinching when he spoke and dropped away when he was ashamed of needing help. She knew Harlan Prentiss, not personally, but by reputation and by one encounter with his people that had made his character clear to her. She knew that a man who would send 2 people to put their hands on a contracted auditor over a filed report was a man who believed his money made him untouchable, and men who believed that were dangerous in a very specific way. They were surprised by consequences. And she knew something else. Something Daniel didn't know yet. 3 months ago, her neighbor Denny Rourke, whose property sat between hers and the eastern edge of the Prentiss operation, had mentioned at the feed store that he'd been approached about leasing his grazing land to Prentiss for the season. He'd said yes, mostly because the price was good and he needed it. But he'd also mentioned, almost offhandedly, that when the Prentiss hands had moved their cattle through, the herd count had looked thin to him. Denny had been in cattle 40 years. His count was not casual. She'd thought nothing of it at the time. Now she thought of it very hard. At 2 in the morning, she went to the old filing cabinet in the back room. Walt's filing cabinet, which she'd never had the heart to empty because it still smelled faintly of the cedar chips he'd kept in his desk drawer, and she found the folder she was looking for. Walt had kept records of everything, a habit she'd absorbed through 20 years of marriage until she kept records of everything too. Correspondence, sale receipts, pasture lease agreements. And there, near the back, a handwritten note from Denny Rourke dated 6 weeks ago, asking if she knew anyone who might want to buy out his lease agreement with Prentiss before spring, because something about the arrangement was starting to bother him. She set the note on the desk and looked at it for a long time. Strange how the things you've given up on tend to find you. It rose in her mind like something she hadn't known she was thinking. She'd given up on this fight when it was only her land at stake. Given up on the idea that one woman on a reduced operation, for years widowed, with no particular standing in the county's business circles, could do much about the shape of things. But this wasn't only her land anymore. And Daniel Voss hadn't come to her door because he had nowhere else to go. He'd come because she'd left the light on. She went back to the living room. She sat in Walt's chair until the sky outside the window went from black to the gray-blue of early dawn. Then she got up, put the kettle on, and went to knock on the spare room door. Tell me something, and I mean this genuinely, because it matters to this story. When Daniel made that choice to keep his figures accurate, knowing what it might cost him, what would you have done in his position? Would you have adjusted the numbers? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one of them, and your answers always teach me something. They were at the table with their second cups when the truck came down the road. Maura had heard it before she saw it, the particular sound of a diesel engine running at low speed, the way you drive when you're looking for something rather than going somewhere. She got up without rushing and moved to the window and looked through the gap in the curtain. Big truck. New. 2 men in the cab. It slowed at her gate and sat there for a moment, idling. Don't move, she said quietly. Daniel had gone still in his chair. His good hand was flat on the table. She noticed he didn't reach for anything, didn't panic, just went still in the deliberate way of someone who'd already calculated his options and was waiting to see which one became necessary. She noted this. The truck sat at the gate for perhaps 40 seconds. Then it moved on. She stayed at the window until it had gone out of earshot. Then she turned around. They're looking, she said. They don't know you're here yet. They know you're in this area. How much time do we have? Less than I'd like. She picked up her cup and drank the last of it and set it down. Here's what I need you to do. I need you to write down every detail of your audit, every figure, every GPS coordinates of your count positions, every date, every name, every contact at that lender. Everything. I have paper and I have pens and I have a satellite phone. And in 45 minutes, I'm going to call 3 separate people. Denny Rourke, who has evidence of his own. A woman named Patricia Hess at the Wyoming Department of Agriculture who I have met exactly twice, but who I know by reputation to be someone who takes inventory fraud very seriously. And my brother-in-law, Carl, who is a recently retired FBI agent living in Billings and who I never wanted to involve in my business affairs, but who I am involving now. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Maura, he said, you don't have to do this. I know that. This isn't your fight. She had 3 things she could have said to that. She chose the shortest one. It is now, she said, and pushed the notepad across the table. Write everything down. Don't leave anything out because you think it's too small. The small things are always what hold it together. He picked up the pen. While he wrote, she went to the barn. Not to hide, not to prepare an escape. She went because it was where she thought most clearly, always had been, the combination of cool air and the particular quiet of animals breathing that settled something in her that the house didn't settle. She moved through the stalls, checking the horses with her hands on their necks and shoulders, the automatic reassurance of that contact, and she let herself understand what she was doing. She was not being brave. She had done brave things before, and she knew the feeling, that specific elevation of fear into something useful. This was different. This was simply the recognition that a problem had arrived at her door, and she was the person in the position to do something about it. And she had lived long enough to know that people who wait for someone more qualified to step forward often wait past the only moment the step was possible. Walt would have said she was being reckless. Walt would also have been on the satellite phone by now. She went back inside. The calls took an hour and a half. Denny Rourke answered on the second ring and said, "I've been waiting for someone to call me about this," in the tone of a man who has been holding a piece of uncomfortable information and hoping someone would take it off his hands. He agreed to get in his truck and drive to Maura's before noon with everything he had. Patricia Hess at the Department of Agriculture was in a meeting, and her assistant took a message, and 40 minutes later Patricia Hess called back and listened to a 4-minute summary from Maura without interrupting once, and then said, "I need you to not let that auditor leave your property. I'm making a call." Carl answered from Billings with the particular wary patience of a retired law enforcement officer who has received calls from family members and learned not to assume they were social. He listened. He asked 8 questions. He said, "I have 2 people I can have in a car in 20 minutes. Maura told him not to make that call until he heard from her again. He said he wouldn't. She knew he already had. At 10:40 in the morning, Harlan Prentiss himself drove through her gate. She had not been expecting this. She had expected the 2 men in the truck. She had expected a level of escalation that could be handled at the property line with a gate latch and a firm voice. She had not expected a man in his mid-60s with silver hair and a pressed jacket and the kind of unhurried manner that came from 40 years of being in rooms where he was the person with the most money. He got out of his truck alone and walked toward the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets. And she came out the front door and stood at the top step, and Biscuit sat next to her left boot and did not move. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. "Wondered if I could have a word." "About what?" she said. He smiled, the way men who are used to making people comfortable with their presence deploy that smile like a hand they expect you to take. "I heard there might be a misunderstanding about some business in the valley. I like to address misunderstandings personally." "That's thoughtful of you," she said. "I also heard you might have had a visitor last night." She said nothing. He tilted his head. "Small county," he said. "Word gets around." He paused, seeming to think about his next sentence. "The man you may have spoken to, if you have, is in some legal difficulty. I'd hate for anyone else to be drawn into that." She looked at him with the same flat patience she gave to Weather. "Mr. Prentiss," she said, "I've had my gate closed since 6 this morning. Anyone who was driving past it slowly last night was doing so from the county road, which is public property, and I'd encourage them to stay on it." His smile did not change, but something behind it did. "I've made you some good offers on this land," he said. "You have. The offer still stands." "It will continue to stand," she said, "right where I left it." He looked at the property, the barn, the pasture, the fence line, with the particular look of someone assessing an asset rather than admiring a place. Then he looked back at her. "This is a lot of land for one person to manage." She let the silence hold for a moment. Then she said, without heat, without the satisfaction of letting him know how much she was not afraid of him, "I manage it just fine." He nodded once. He turned and walked back to his truck, and she watched him go with both hands loose at her sides. And when he pulled out through the gate, she let out one slow breath and went back inside. Daniel was standing in the kitchen doorway. He'd heard it all through the screen. "He knows," he said. "He suspected," she said. "Now he knows. Which means we have less time than before." She picked up the satellite phone. "It's time to call Carl." By late afternoon, her kitchen had 3 extra people in it. Denny Rourke, 71 years old and smelling of diesel and determination, with a manila folder of his own lease paperwork and handwritten cattle counts covering 6 weeks. Patricia Hess, who had driven 3 hours from Cheyenne with a state investigator named Tolliver, who wore a tie and said almost nothing but wrote down everything. And Carl, her brother-in-law, who had in fact put 2 former colleagues in a car in Billings, and who was now on the phone in her living room in the specific low voice of a man who was calling in something he had been saving. Daniel sat at the kitchen table with his documented audit and his splinted arm and the expression of a man who had knocked on a stranger's door with nothing but a name and a desperate story, and was now watching a room of people treat those things as though they were enough. He looked at her once, across the room, and she gave him a small nod that meant keep going. "We're not done yet." What happened next did not happen overnight in the dramatic way that certain kinds of stories prefer. It happened the way real consequences tend to happen in a county like that one, which is to say slowly at first, and then with the particular inevitability of water finding a crack and following it. The state investigator requested records. The lender and Cody, presented with Daniel's report and the growing corroboration, suspended the loan application and opened their own internal review. Two of Prentiss's ranch managers, it emerged, had been counting and recounting the same animals in rotation during inspection windows, and when the timing of those rotations was mapped against the GPS data in Daniel's audit notes, the pattern was unmistakable. Harlan Prentiss retained lawyers, which was his right, and the lawyers were good ones, which was expected. But the lawyers could not unfind what had been found, and they could not unfile what had been filed, and they could not explain away 1,400 head of cattle that the land itself couldn't support. The investigation widened. 3 other loan applications from the previous 4 years came under review. 2 of them showed similar discrepancies. Prentiss did not go to prison. Maura never expected him to. That was not the shape of this story, and she'd known it. What he did was pay back the fraudulently secured funds with interest under terms negotiated by attorneys and overseen by a federal financial crimes office that Carl had been quietly pointed toward. His operation was placed under a compliance monitor for 3 years. He sold the eastern parcels to cover the settlement. He was not destroyed. He was, more precisely, made to reckon, the quiet kind of reckoning that takes a man who has spent 40 years believing his money protected him from consequences and shows him, without ceremony, that it does not. Daniel's audit was formally accepted, and his professional standing was not only intact, but quietly elevated in the circles where these things mattered. The lender sent him a letter. He mentioned this to Maura on the phone, in November, with the tone of someone who is not sure how to receive a good thing. "You earned that," she said. "I had help. You filed an honest report when dishonesty would have been easy," she said. "I just had a satellite phone." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My truck is still behind that gas station in Meeteetse. I know. I drove past it last week. Someone left a note under the wiper." "What did it say?" "Said they hoped the owner was all right." She paused. "Small county." He laughed, a real one, surprised out of him. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh. She noted that too. He came back in December, officially, driving a different truck. He said he'd been contracted to do a follow-up count on the Prentiss herd for the compliance monitor and that the work would take 4 days, and he was staying in Cody. She told him Cody was 40 minutes away and she had a perfectly serviceable spare room. He said he didn't want to impose. She said the room was just sitting there. He came the next morning and fixed the hinge on the barn door that she'd been meaning to get to for 6 weeks. She didn't ask him to. She came out of the house and found him crouched in the cold with his tools and a new hinge pin, working with the kind of careful precision of a man who had learned that when you are given a place to stand, you take care of it. She made coffee and brought him a cup and set it on the fence post where he could reach it. He looked up. She looked at the hinge. She looked at the coffee. She said, almost to herself, because it was the kind of thing you didn't say into a full silence. He walked 3 days on bleeding feet to get to her door. "I figure he can manage one hinged morning." He looked at her. She was already walking back toward the house. "That's not quite how that went," he said. "Close enough," she said, without turning around. If this story touched something in you tonight, if you found yourself somewhere in Maura's quiet waiting, or in Daniel's long walk toward a light he wasn't sure would still be on, please take a moment and hit the like button. And if you'd like more stories where the overlooked are recognized, the patient are rewarded, and the ending is always worth waiting for, subscribe. I'll be right here every week, keeping the light on for you. The investigation closed formally in February. Denny Rourke sold his lease rights back to himself and ran his own cattle on the eastern pasture that spring. Patricia Hess sent a handwritten note that Maura put in the filing cabinet next to the folder of Walt's papers, not to archive it, but because it felt like it belonged in good company. Daniel's 4-day job stretched to 6, and then the compliance monitor asked him to return in March, and then in May, and somewhere in the careful accumulation of those returns, the spare room stopped being called the spare room and started being called his room, and nobody said this out loud because it didn't need to be said, the way most true things eventually stop needing to be announced. He asked her once, in the early spring, standing in the lower pasture in the last light of a long day, whether she ever regretted opening the door that night. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about things. No, she said, even knowing what it cost you. What it cost me, she said, was one night without sleep. She looked at the cattle moving slowly in the far field, the last amber of the light lying across their backs. What it gave me was considerably more complicated. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what does it feel like to have lived so long and kept things so intact? She considered that question for the length of one slow, deliberate breath. Then she said the thing that was simply and plainly true, the thing she had not known she'd learned until the learning was already behind her. The door, she said. It's not courage that makes you open it. It's just the decision not to spend your whole life pretending you didn't hear the knock. The following October, a full year from the night he had leaned against her porch post with nothing left to offer but his name, she was at the fence checking the gate latch in the early evening when she heard his truck coming down the road. She did not turn around. She heard him stop and get out and walk across the gravel and come to stand beside her at the fence line, looking out at the same pasture she was looking at. The sky was going purple and gold, the way Wyoming skies do in October, like they are apologizing for the winter coming. Biscuit sat between them. Neither one of them said anything, because the particular warmth of that moment did not require anything said. Only the open gate, the cattle coming in from the lower field in their slow, certain way, the smell of cold air and hay, the sound of a life that had not been over after all. Next week, I'll be bringing you the story of a woman in 1930s New Mexico who was handed a failing ranch by a bank that expected her to walk away, and instead spent 3 silent years turning it into something no one in the territory had ever seen before. I think you're going to stay for every word of it. Until then, thank you for being here, for listening, and for carrying these stories with you. Take care of yourselves. Good night.